At 70 years old, Evelyn believed that her children were her greatest legacy. After 40 years of working double shifts at the local mill, surviving on black coffee and hope just to put her son and daughter through Ivy League universities, she thought she had earned the right to a quiet sunset in the only home she had ever known. She was wrong. Evelyn lived in a fading wooden farmhouse in the heart of the American Rust Belt. The house smelled of old books and dried apple blossoms from the orchard out back, the orchard her mother, Rose, had tended until the day she died. To Evelyn, this wasn't just real estate, it was an altar to 3 generations of women who had survived through grit and grace. But to her children, Connor and Bridget, the house was just an obstacle. Connor, a stockbroker whose expensive suits couldn't hide the desperation in his eyes, and Bridget, a woman who measured her worth by the labels on her handbags, arrived on a Tuesday. They didn't bring groceries or flowers. They brought a notary and a stack of legal documents. "Mom, you've been so forgetful lately," Bridget said, her voice dripping with a fake, sugary concern that didn't reach her cold eyes. "We're worried. Robert and I discussed it. It's better if we manage the property so you don't have to worry about the taxes or the maintenance anymore. It's for your own protection." Eleanor looked at her children, the babies she had nursed, the teenagers she had protected. She was tired. Her bones ached from 70 years of labor. She trusted them, because in her world you didn't need a contract to love your own blood. She signed the papers. The ink wasn't even dry when the mask slipped. "The movers will be here at 8 a.m. tomorrow," Connor said, checking his gold watch. He didn't look at his mother, he looked at the cracked ceiling as if calculating the cost of a bulldozer. "We've already sold the land to a logistics company. They're clearing the orchard for a warehouse. It's a 7-figure deal, Mom. You should be happy for us." Eleanor's heart didn't just break, it shattered. "The orchard? But your grandmother Rose, she's buried under the great oak tree. This is our home." "It's an asset, Mom," Bridget snapped, tossing a cheap brochure onto the kitchen table. "And this is your new home. It's a state-funded facility 3 towns over. They have bingo on Thursdays. Don't make this difficult." Eleanor was 70 years old, penniless, and discarded like a piece of trash by the very people she had lived for. She was being sent to a facility for the indigent, with nothing but a single suitcase and the clothes on her back. But what Connor and Bridget didn't know, what their greed made them too blind to see, was that Evelyn's mother, Rose, had seen this coming 40 years ago. She knew the darkness in her grandchildren's hearts, and she had built a trap that was about to snap shut. Before we reveal the secret hidden behind a 50-year-old portrait, make sure to subscribe to Alex's Stories and hit that notification bell. Because this story is proof that a mother's love can reach out from beyond the grave to deliver the ultimate justice. The next morning, the sun didn't rise, it just turned the sky a bruised shade of gray. Eleanor stood on the porch clutching a single suitcase. Connor stood by his luxury SUV, impatiently tapping the steering wheel. "Leave the junk, Mom," he shouted. "We're clearing it all out." Eleanor ignored him. She went back inside one last time and grabbed the only thing she truly valued, a heavy, silver-framed portrait of her mother, Rose. As she walked down the porch steps, Bridget snatched the photo from her hands. "Give me that. The frame is sterling silver. It's worth at least $500. Bridget yanked the photo so hard it slipped. The frame hit the gravel driveway and shattered. Bridget cursed, stepping over the broken glass to get into the car. Eleanor knelt in the dirt, her hands trembling as she picked up the ruined portrait of her mother. But as she pulled the photograph away from the broken glass, she felt something hard taped to the back. It was an old, heavy iron key and a small yellowed note in her mother's elegant handwriting that read, "Evelyn, my brave girl, when the world turns cold and your own blood forgets your name, go to the orchard, find the tallest oak, trust me one last time." Eleanor looked at the key, then at her children who were laughing in the car, already spending the money from the sale of her soul. They thought they had won. They thought she was a broken old woman with nowhere to go. But as Eleanor gripped that iron key, she felt a spark of fire she hadn't felt in decades. Her mother hadn't just left her a house. She had left her a war. And Eleanor was finally ready to fight. The state-funded facility, St. Jude's Home for the Indigent, was exactly what Bridget had promised it wouldn't be. There was no bingo, there was no laughter. There was only the suffocating smell of industrial bleach boiled cabbage and the quiet, rhythmic sound of shuffling feet in the hallways. Evelyn was placed in a room with 3 other women. Her space was a twin bed with a thin, scratchy blue blanket and a metal locker that didn't lock. For the first 3 days, Evelyn sat on the edge of that bed staring at the wall. She was waiting. Every time the door opened, her heart leaped, thinking it was Connor coming to tell her it was all a mistake. Every time the communal phone rang down the hall, she hoped it was Bridget calling to say she missed her. On the 4th day, she gathered her courage and used her one allotted phone call. She dialed Connor's number. "The subscriber you are trying to reach is not accepting calls at this time." He had blocked her. She dialed Bridget. It rang once before going straight to voicemail. "Hey, it's Bridget. Leave a message after the beep. Unless you're looking for a loan, then hang up." Ha ha. Evelyn didn't leave a message. She hung up the receiver and stood in the dim hallway, surrounded by people who had been forgotten by the world, and realized the most bitter truth of her 70 years. She hadn't raised children. She had raised strangers. That night, the fear turned into a freezing cold despair. Evelyn lay under that scratchy blanket, her body aching from the hard mattress, and wondered if she had failed as a mother. Had she worked too much? Had she loved them too poorly? How could the toddlers she had tucked into bed with stories of magic and kindness turn into adults who could leave her in a place like this? She felt invisible. She felt erased in the eyes of the state. She was just a number. In the eyes of her children, she was just a clear debt. But then her hand brushed against her suitcase. She sat up in the dark, her roommates snoring softly around her, and pulled out the silver-framed portrait. The glass was gone, the silver frame twisted, but the image of her mother, Rose, remained. Rose looked back at her with those sharp, knowing eyes, the eyes of a woman who had survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars. Evelyn pulled the iron key from her pocket. It felt heavy. It felt powerful. She read the note again by the dim light of the hallway lamp. "When the world turns cold and your own blood forgets your name, go to the orchard." Evelyn realized something then. Her mother hadn't just been a gardener. Rose had been a protector. She had seen the greed in Connor's eyes when he was just 10 years old. She had seen the vanity in Bridget's heart when she was a teenager. Rose had known that one day Evelyn would be exactly where she was right now, alone and discarded, and she had left a fail-safe. Eleanor looked at the clock on the wall. 2 a.m. She knew the logistics company was scheduled to begin bulldozing the orchard in less than 48 hours. If she didn't get back there, whatever Rose had hidden would be buried under 10 feet of concrete forever. She didn't have a car. She didn't have money. But she had the grit of a woman who had worked 40 years in a mill. Evelyn didn't pack her clothes. She didn't need them. She took her mother's portrait, the iron key, and her heavy winter coat. She slipped out of the room through the fire exit that she had propped open with a sneaker earlier that evening and stepped out into the biting Michigan winter. She walked 3 miles to the nearest bus station in the freezing wind. Her lungs burned. Her legs screamed for her to stop. But every time she felt like giving up, she pictured Connor's smirking face as he sold her soul, and she kept moving. She used the last $20 hidden in the lining of her coat to buy a one-way ticket back to her town. As the bus hissed and roared through the dark, snowy highways, Eleanor sat by the window clutching the iron key in her pocket. She was 70 years old. She was homeless. She was Lou Lint, according to her children. But as the bus crossed the county line, Eleanor Sterling stopped being a victim. She didn't know what was under that oak tree. She didn't know if it was gold or papers or just another mystery. But she knew one thing: she was going home. And God help anyone who tried to stand in her way. The bus dropped Evelyn off at the edge of the county line at 4 a.m. The world was a blur of white and shadow. She walked the final mile to the orchard, her breath hitching in the frozen air. When she reached the gate, her heart sank. The orchard was covered in neon orange surveyor's tape. Massive yellow bulldozers sat like sleeping monsters at the edge of the property, ready to tear the soul out of the land at sunrise. Connor and Bridget hadn't just sold her home. They had sold the very earth that held her mother's memory. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She climbed over the low stone wall and trudged through the deep snow toward the center of the orchard. There stood the great oak, a 300-year-old giant with branches like reaching arms. She didn't have a shovel. She used a heavy tire iron she had found by the road in her own bare hands. Her fingernails were caked with frozen earth, her fingers numb with cold. But she didn't stop. She dug until her knuckles bled, until finally 3 feet down she hit something solid, metal. She pulled out a heavy iron box wrapped tightly in thick, waterproof waxed canvas. Eleanor sat in the snow, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pulled the iron key from her pocket. It fit perfectly. With a heavy click, the lid creaked open. Evelyn expected gold. She expected jewelry, something she could sell to survive, but as she looked inside, she found only paper. Dozens of yellowed legal documents tied with a fading blue ribbon. She pulled out the top sheet. It was a letter from her mother, Rose, dated 1984. Evelyn, the letter read, I saw them today. I saw Connor steal your wedding ring and lie to your face about it. I saw Bridget ruin your best dress and smile while you cried. They are small, greedy spirits, my daughter, and I know that one day their greed will grow into a monster that will try to swallow you whole. Evelyn gasped, the cold air stinging her lungs. Her mother had seen the truth 40 years ago. As Evelyn flipped through the legal documents, the brilliance of Rose's plan revealed itself. Rose hadn't left the land to Evelyn directly. She knew Evelyn's heart was too soft, that she would eventually give in to her children's demands. Instead, Rose had placed the entire orchard into something called a Perpetual Nature Conservation Trust. The contract was a masterpiece of legal entrapment. It stated that the land was designated for agricultural and conservation use forever. If the land was ever sold or repurposed for anything other than farming, like, for instance, a warehouse, a poison pill clause was triggered. First, every cent of the sale price would automatically be diverted to a global environmental charity. Connor and Bridget wouldn't see a single penny. But it got worse. The contract also mandated that the sellers, the children, would be personally liable to pay a desecration penalty to the state equal to the full market value of the land. Rose hadn't just protected the land, she had set a trap. By selling the orchard to the logistics company, Connor and Bridget hadn't just failed to get rich, they had legally bankrupted themselves. They owed millions of dollars they didn't have. They had stepped right into the noose Rose had tied 40 years ago. But there was one final thing at the bottom of the box, a small, leather-bound savings book from the local Oakhaven Bank. Evelyn opened it and stared at the numbers. For 20 years, Rose had secretly deposited every penny she made from selling her famous apple pies and bushels of fruit. $5 here, $10 there. She had put it all into a high-yield account in Evelyn's name only, starting in the early 80s. With 40 years of compound interest, the balance was staggering. It was over $2 million. Evelyn sat in the snow and let out a sob that was half laugh, half cry. Her mother had spent 2 decades baking pies in a hot kitchen, saving nickels and dimes, all to ensure that one day her daughter would never have to answer to anyone ever again. Evelyn looked at the house where the lights were turning on. Connor and Bridget were probably inside, drinking expensive champagne, celebrating the sale that was about to destroy them. Evelyn stood up. She wasn't cold anymore. She wasn't tired. She brushed the dirt off her coat and gripped the legal folder. The sun began to peek over the horizon, hitting the orange surveyor's tape. The bulldozers began to growl to life. Evelyn Sterling started walking toward her house. She had the truth in her hand, $2 million in her name, and the ghost of her mother at her back. Inside the farmhouse, the heat was cranked up to 80 degrees. Connor was leaning against the kitchen counter, swirling a glass of vintage crystal, while Bridget was on her laptop scrolling through luxury real estate listings in Miami. "I'm telling you, Bridget," Connor laughed, his voice loud with drunken confidence, "by this time tomorrow the first wire transfer hits. We'll be clear of our debts and halfway to the coast before the old woman even finishes her first game of bingo." Bridget smirked, not even looking up. "It's a mercy, really. She belongs in that home. At least now she won't have to worry about the roof leaking." The siblings froze. Standing in the doorway was a ghost. Evelyn was covered in snow. Her hands were caked with dirt, her fingernails bloodied from digging in the frozen earth. She looked like a wild animal, but her eyes were as sharp and cold as a winter morning in the orchard. "Mom," Bridget gasped, her wine glass slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. "How did you get here? You're supposed to be in a cage." Evelyn finished the sentence, her voice calm and resonant. She didn't yell, she didn't cry. She walked into the kitchen and set the dirt-stained legal folder on the counter right next to Connor's expensive champagne. "Get out," Connor snarled, recovered from his shock. "You signed the papers, Mom. This house belongs to us now." "You're trespassing. I'll call the police." Go ahead, Connor. Call them, Evelyn said, pulled out a chair and sat down at her own table. But before you do, you might want to call your lawyer and maybe a bankruptcy attorney. She slid the top document from the folder across the counter. Your grandmother Rose was a lot of things, Evelyn said, her voice dripping with a quiet, terrifying satisfaction. But above all, she was a protector. She knew exactly what kind of people you would become. She knew you'd try to sell this land the moment she was gone. Connor's smirk faded as he began to read. His face turned from red to a ghostly, sickly white. What is this? He stammered. A perpetual nature trust? It's a poison pill, Connor, Evelyn explained. The moment you signed that contract with the logistics company, you triggered a clause Grandmother Rose wrote 40 years ago. Because this land is a designated sanctuary. Any sale for non-agricultural use is legally null and void. The sale price you were expecting, every single penny of that wire transfer is being diverted to an environmental preservation fund. You will never see a cent of it. Bridget lunged for the paper, her voice rising to a shriek. That can't be right. We own the deed. You own a deed you can't sell, Evelyn countered, and it gets better. Read page 4 since you've already signed the contract and accepted the deposit. You are now personally liable for the desecration penalty. You owe the state of Michigan $3 million for attempting to destroy a protected sanctuary. And since you've already spent the deposit money on those suits and that wine, I believe that makes you both criminally liable for fraud. Connor collapsed into a chair, the champagne glass falling from his hand. The reality hit them like a freight train. They weren't just poor. They were ruined. They were bankrupted by a woman who had been dead for 20 years. Bridget turned to Evelyn, her face twisted in a mask of desperate, fake tears. Mom, please, you have to help us. We didn't know we can fix this together. You love us, right? Evelyn looked at her daughter, the woman who had mocked her Lou Lent only days ago. I love the children you used to be, Evelyn said, standing up. But those children died a long time ago. My mother worked herself to the bone to make sure I would never be a victim of your greed. She left me $2 million in a secret account that you can't touch. I have the money to pay your fines, but I won't. I'm buying this house back from the bank after you lose it in foreclosure, Evelyn said, walking toward the door. I'm turning the orchard into a sanctuary for people who actually value the land. As for you two, you have 24 hours to pack your things and leave. If you ever set foot on this property again, I will hand the fraud evidence to the district attorney. Connor and Bridget sat in the middle of their ruined celebration, surrounded by the smell of expensive wine and the cold reality of their own destruction. Evelyn walked back out into the snow. She looked up at the great oak. For the first time in 70 years, she didn't feel like a mother who had failed. She felt like a daughter who had finally understood the greatest lesson her mother ever taught. Love doesn't just nurture. Sometimes love has teeth. Evelyn just delivered a masterclass in justice. She didn't just win back her home, she reclaimed her soul. She proved that being 70 years old isn't the end of a story. It's just the beginning of a powerful new chapter. Before we reveal the beautiful final gift Rose left for Evelyn, and how she used her fortune to change the lives of dozens of others, make sure you are subscribed to Alex's Stories. Hit that like button if you were cheering for Evelyn, and type "Unstoppable" in the comments if you believe that justice always finds its way to the right address. Your dreams don't have an expiration date, and your worth isn't defined by those who are too blind to see it. Now, let's see how Evelyn turned her mother's secret into a lighthouse for the forgotten. 6 months later, the surveyor's tape was gone. The growling bulldozers had been replaced by the rhythmic sound of pruning shears and the laughter of children. Spring had arrived in the Rust Belt, and the orchard was putting on a spectacular show. Thousands of apple trees were covered in a blanket of white and pink blossoms, their scent filling the air with the promise of a massive harvest. Connor and Bridget were long gone. Facing millions in fines and the threat of criminal fraud charges, they had fled the state, settling into a life of debt and obscurity. They had learned the hard way that you cannot build a future by burning down your past. Evelyn had used her mother's secret trust to transform the orchard into something magnificent. She founded Rose's Haven, a non-profit sanctuary for older women who had been discarded by their families or left with nothing. The farmhouse was no longer a site of lonely dinners. It was now a bustling hub where grandmothers taught young orphans how to bake pies, how to garden, and most importantly, how to value themselves. Evelyn had realized that her mother hadn't just saved her. Rose had provided the resources to save an entire community. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Evelyn sat on her porch, holding a worn piece of paper she had found at the very bottom of the iron box. It was a final note from Rose, written only days before she passed away in the late 90s. Evelyn, the note read, "You spent so many years being a mother, a wife, and a worker. I saw you disappear into everyone else's needs. I built this sanctuary not just to keep you safe, but to give you the one thing I never fully had, the freedom to find out who you are when nobody is watching. Don't just tend the trees, my girl, bloom." Evelyn looked at her hands. They were no longer bloodied or dirt-stained. They were strong, steady, and full of purpose. Eleanor Sterling was 70 years old. She had been betrayed by her own blood and left for dead in a cold, sterile room. But standing here, in the middle of her mother's masterpiece, she realized that the most beautiful chapter of her life wasn't behind her. It was happening right now. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a service provider. She was the queen of the orchard, a protector of the forgotten, and a woman who had finally learned to bloom. Because as Evelyn looked out over the blossoms, she knew one thing for certain. Justice might move slowly and love might protect itself in mysterious ways, but the address is never, ever wrong.